fact sheet that you will be able to access and to download from the PowerShift Africa website and take more information from there. And then you are also very much invited to keep engaging with us with this conversation. Right. So without further ado, I think I'll set Rajneesh to set us off in terms of what we are discussing about today with AFREXIM Bank. So Rajneesh, let me start with you. And I think how I am thinking of this as a good way to start this conversation is AFREXIM Bank positions itself as a driver of trade and development for Africa. From your work scrutinizing development banks in general, from the multilateral space, what risks do you think AFREXIM Bank continues to do by channeling its resources into fossil fuel projects instead of renewables?
Thanks a lot, Kuda, and good afternoon, good evening, or could be morning, depending on the time zones we've joined on. First of all, very hearty congratulations to PowerShift on launching, the really insightful fact sheet, and I think a lot of basic information around, what the AFREXIM Bank does, what its history is, what it's been, what its projections are in terms of what it wants to finance in the next couple of years, has been put there. But I think it's right to open up, this discussion around the risks. We've just come off, the Africa Climate Summit just over, I think, over a month ago, and it was quite an interesting summit because there was a lot of asks, from African civil society, but also African leaders around, just transition, ensuring energy access gets to the continent, at least for the 600 million people that don't have it, and we're also looking at African solutions for the continent. But the fact that the AFREXIM Bank is looking at continuously backing fossil fuels as that solution, that for me is already the first risk, because instead of thinking of the continent where we have over 60% solar, if we have almost 40% wind, and a lot of transitional critical minerals that can power industrialization for the next 20-30 years, and the next couple of decades to come, AFREXIM Bank is running the risk of locking in stranded assets and a lot of fiscal exposure, because they want to continuously fund oil and gas projects, a lot of coal infrastructure as well, and without continuously talking about what the challenges with fossil fuels are. And I think a lot of discussions have focused on that. I think the fact that we are looking at the year where there's the G20, we have to talk about finance, we have to talk about reparations, we have to talk about sovereign and corporate debt stress that our countries are in. So if we're going to have a bank like AFREXIM fund more oil and gas projects on the continent, that's definitely just you're thinking about more debt stricken countries. A second one is, if you're going to finance fossil fuels, then you're crowding out renewables and regional value chains. It means every dollar that you're trying to fund fossil infrastructure means less concessional space for distributed renewables, transmission upgrades, local manufacturing of clean energy components. The continent itself, if I've already talked about it, I've already mentioned it, you don't have to ask any you can ask any child, perhaps, what's the one thing that's always available? The sun. That's something we're supposed to tap into. So rather than tapping into fossil fuels and financing renewables, the bank is continuously thinking of expanding their strategy around fossil fuels. Another thing can be reputational and alignment risk. Financing new fossil fuel projects means the bank is directly contradicting the African Union's climate change and resilient development strategy. A lot of African countries are now developing their NDCs. A couple of them have already submitted them, and it does not contain a lot of information around fossil fuels. Many of them are looking at renewable energy and clean energy sources, as well as their critical minerals to push them forward and also reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So if the bank is going to finance that, then that's definitely an alignment risk. And lastly, it also it undermines the bank's own Transforming Africa trade vision strategy, where instead of bringing together most of the partners, like the EU, the AFTB, under the climate finance narrative, now they're trying to expose it, to the fossils again. And lastly, from a community perspective, I think the fact that the bank is, again, without continuously talking about fossil fuels, because that's the agenda of the bank, they run the risk of social and environmental justice liabilities, because without adequate free prior informed consent, without compensation, any of the fossil fuel projects that they plan to fund in the future means they're opening themselves up to litigation. And with the latest ICJ ruling, it means anything that they finance, they can be held liable if there is issues that communities suffer, and remedy goes back to them. So is it something that they're ready for? Yeah, thanks. Over to you, Kuda.
Thanks for that, Rajneesh. I think that was really fantastic, and I think you showed the potential that African Bank has by moving to the renewable energy space, but more importantly, the danger that they're facing by remaining in that fossil fuel led and bred system of development. And just to allow the audience to know why I feel like it's important to get some outside perspectives before we actually present the fact sheet is because we don't want the conversation to be about the fact sheet, but more about the perceptions around African Bank. So thank you so much, Rajneesh, for that. And we'll continue with that. And I think, Sada, it'll be great to then have you coming in to basically give us the landscape, right, of this climate related financing and how it's working. So, with that said, we are aware that. African Bank is not the only player in this game, be it DFIs or private banks, right? So, what do you think are the most strategic opportunities for the bank in terms of the shift, as Rajneesh said, towards clean energy and at the same time without undermining the trade focused mandate of this bank?
Thank you, Kuda, for the question, and welcome to this webinar. Good after, I think it's good evening in Nairobi. So hi everyone. So maybe just to start off, I think we need to recognize that generally there's growing recognition of the need for financial institutions, especially whether it's DFIs or even local institutions, to play a key role in terms of financing climate action, both mitigation and adaptation at both global and continental level. And that's why, if you're following the outcome from Baku last year, the new collective quantified goal, which is the new climate finance target, and even the aspirational ambition of the roadmap to 1.3 trillion, has included MDBs as key players and also contributors to achieving this goal. And this is not just for them to, contribute to the goal per se, but also to strategically deploy the public resources that they have, to scale up other sources of finance, also enhance access and utilization of these resources at country level. And this means that financial institutions have to strengthen sort of the alignment of the operations with the Paris Agreement, strategies with these climate finance goals, and also go beyond that to also sort of align with the SDG priorities of, for example, ending poverty, which is critical for the African continent. And I think it's important, as we have this conversation, to also think about how these MDBs are currently engaging in this UNFCCC process, especially around climate action and financing. And you see more of these banks actually engaging in this process. For example, the AFREXIM Bank, AFDB Bank have been prominent in these spaces. But the issue is, are they influencing the right things, or they're sort of pushing on different direction? So I think this recognition of the financial institutions is probably more important at the continental level, since Africa currently receives negligible amount of climate financing, and we're seeing even this limited financing declining over time, and also some of them being cut off, especially in terms of public finance. And therefore, Africa needs to sort of finance its own resilience and just transition pathways. You can no longer rely on external financing. So how do we enhance and sort of galvanize resource mobilization at the continental level? And I think this advocacy effort now targeting AFREXIM Bank and also other continental financial institutions is super timely and very important at this point. If you've seen during the Africa Climate Summit, I think Raj has mentioned this as well, there's a lot of call on from African leaders to sort of emphasize the role of financial institutions on the continent, support just transition and also climate issues alongside development objectives. However, you find there's need for these leaders to go further because they are the shareholders and they have that power to sort of guide the strategic vision and policies and resource capacities of these institutions to ensure that there's that alignment with the priorities of the continent. And it's also possible for this institution like AFREXIM, which is largely now supporting fossil fuel in its current portfolio, to sort of transform and transition into sort of increasing its share of financing for renewable energy on the continent. And this actually depends on the resource capacity. So African governments, I think, need to sort of use their shareholding capacity to increase the internal resources available to these institutions so that they can also mobilize resources within the continent and outside the continent. And I think an example of such initiative where Africans leaders take initiative and governments lead advocacy effort in terms of policy direction is what we saw at the Africa Climate Summit last month, where 9 banks came together to sort of commit to support the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative. And AFREXIM is one of those banks. So I think with governments taking that role and also setting the agenda in terms of the strategic vision of these banks, it can also sort of help these banks to also transition towards clean financing clean initiatives. And I think just to also mention, AFREXIM being a trade and development partner in the continent is also well positioned to sort of leverage on existing frameworks like Africa Continental Free Trade Area to support how African countries can easily transition to low carbon manufacturing and also trade through sustainable financing. Of course, aligning its own policies, internal policies with these African priorities in terms of just transition. And also looking at how the continent has majority of the micro, small, and medium enterprises are actually considered very much unbankable. They lack collateral, and they also may not have access to most of this financing we're talking about. And I think these institutions on the continent are sort of a key getaway for them for channeling these resources to these SMEs, which are also at the front line of climate, but also they play a key role in critical sectors like agriculture, which can actually boost both adaptation and mitigation benefits. And I think for AFREXIM, there's an opportunity to actually accelerate partnership with other financial institutions that are progressive towards this climate objective. For example, the Africa Development Bank has actually proven that you can sort of balance the two. Transition takes time, but at least try to increase the share of financing for clean technology, clean energy, and even adaptation. So I think sort of leveraging on this partnership with these other institutions on the continent provide that platform for them to show also expertise and also collectively or co-mobilize resources together. It can also provide that opportunity to share best experiences with the banks on the continent. I think majority of the regional development banks we have on the continent are suffering from capital adequacy issues. So if they come together, pool resources, they can actually provide that leverage to the African governments to also sort of mobilize enough resources domestically and externally. And if you look at issues around concessional finances, we hear a lot about a lot of resources being available on the continent in terms of pension funds, which can be used, and also, growth in diaspora remittances that you hear a lot about. How can all these resources be used on the continent to also help mobilize resources for both climate and development? And I think AFREXIM also is an opportunity to address these issues of risk premium in terms of Africa or our institutions accessing finance externally from like external markets. And they can actually do that through, for example, aggregation of climate projects and also providing that regional readiness support to develop these project pipelines, which are considered risky and unbankable for most international institutions. And also being the trade financier, I think AFREXIM also has that great opportunity to also voice and contribute to this advocacy around unilateral trade measures that is basically impeding climate action instead of facilitating. And I think working together with African governments, it's actually an opportunity for this bank to step up and support the Africa's resilience to climate. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Sada. I think you put the expert in being a climate finance expert in there. I think you were speaking about risk premium, trade finance. Yeah, words I would never think about off the top of my head. So thank you so much for that knowledge that you were able to share in terms of those things. And just to remind our colleagues who have participated and joined us here, please feel free to share your comments in the chat group. For those who know me personally, you're being very naughty coming into my WhatsApp signal and putting questions there. It'd be great for you to put them in the chat. I will still ask them on your behalf, but it'd be great to also have them in the chat. So thank you so much for those who have already started providing some questions towards me. And I think now I'd like to get Samuel to then provide the last aspect of this before we get a presentation from Dean on the actual fact sheet in itself. And Samuel, I just wanted to ask you, when it comes to these things like AFREXIM Bank, and I was telling the presenters before we got on that the regional building is being set up in Harare, Zimbabwe. So the Southern Africa branch is being set up in Harare, Zimbabwe, right? And what is interesting to me, we have known about AFREXIM Bank since about 2016, 2017, when they helped us with our currency crisis. But the community and the citizens were angry with that because, they felt as if it was a fluke because of our hyperinflation struggles and they did not support that currency. But what it showed me is that there's something happening regarding the lack of citizen and community involvement in terms of banks such as African Bank. So I wanted to get your perception, Samuel, in terms of how do we get community and citizens involved a bit more in terms of how DFIs are functioning? And you can provide examples of this with some of the projects that they've been funding already, such as the oil and gas project in East Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your name is a bit harder to mention, but thank you very much. And thanks, PowerShift Africa, for for putting in together this information in together about AFREXIM Bank. I think for quite some time now, there has not been a lot of literature written about AFREXIM Bank until the fact sheet putting in together and bringing in civil society organizations together to be able to understand on how they can be able to respond towards how AFREXIM Bank has been financing different projects across the continent. And speaking from a perspective of somebody who has been in a region that has been financed by a project of a fossil fuel project by AFREXIM Bank, it brings in the realities that you find globally there has been recognition that we need to shift out of fossil fuels and go into cleaner energies. But you find a challenge here is that AFREXIM Bank is one that would be aligning their investments with clean energy, but it's going opposite. So it's putting in resources or money in sectors that do not align with the development path that Africa would be eating into. Speaking about one of the projects within the region that I've been working on, the East African crude oil pipeline, you realize that it's a project that is controversial in its nature because of the impact it has on people, it has on nature, and on climate. But you find there are already 46 banks that have already publicly declared that they would not finance this project. We have 29 reinsurance companies that have declared that they will not give any support, and 3 export credit agencies that have publicly declared that they will not support. However, one that still remains up now is AFREXIM Bank that actually committed some of the money. And this is the money that is going in a sector that should not be going in, and yet there is better alternative that they would be going into. So you find there are quite a lot of challenges that it arises with. One, there is investor confidence as well, because you're financing a sector that is actually dwindling, that is going to die in the future. A credible investor would be looking into putting his money in a sector that would be guaranteed reputable returns on investments, but should not be able to cause undue suffering to local communities where these projects are ongoing. So it's more prioritizing profit over the people. The project that is being financed has actually massively displaced people from their land, has cost a lot of local communities their livelihood, right? Specifically in terms of the fishing. We've talked about Lake Albert, which is one of the key ecosystems within the region, a transboundary lake shared between Uganda and the DRC. And this is one of the areas that oil activities are actually happening in, which it happens to be one that is being financed by a project that the AFREXIM Bank which actually happens to be financed by AFREXIM Bank, which is causing all the damage and reputation to the people. But also the social license in terms of how are you going to continue investing in a project that has displaced people? How will you be looked at? What legacy are you leaving behind? Are you going to be remembered as a project, as a financier that financed the project that destroyed and caused a climate crisis that people will be suffering from? or you will be remembered as a financier that actually finance a transition that people are able to enjoy in. And coming in terms of how do we bring in the local communities, how do we bring in the people that are the frontline communities have been impacted by these projects? I think one thing that needs to be done is in terms of the due diligence. There is need for banks across to do actual due diligence on where the money is going into. I believe if for financials like African Bank had done this, they would be able to select clearly where the money would be going into. Because you'll be able to bring in from the bottom up, understand, will this project be able to support the local communities? Will they be able to benefit out of it? Is it environmentally and socially sound? Then the issue of the free, prayer, and informed consent. I think my colleague Raj had mentioned then earlier. We have seen many projects that are actually opening up, coming into the area. Communities are not consulted, they are not involved, their opinions are not captured. And in times where they try to put it, it's actually under influence that they do not participate in the free and fair manner. And this, in the essence, affects the outcome of the consultation that will be undertaken. And I believe the banks, like African Bank, would need to incorporate this to be able to capture the perspectives and opinions of the local community. And I think it's also very important that aligning investments with clear guidelines that have been articulated, like the finance, the IFC performance standards. You find this will be able to ensure that the projects that are being financed are environmentally sound and socially accurate to be able to benefit the local communities. But I think for now, it is not yet aligned on where the investment patterns that African Bank is doing are not clearly defined in terms of to benefit the local communities that they are supposed to. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Samuel. I think you really provide the nexus to show that for banks like AFREXIM Bank, it's extremely important for them to be able to highlight and understand that the future is changing. And with that future, the demands and participation of citizenry is also changing. And that means that their strategies need to also change with that in mind. And I think what we have done in this webinar is to basically provide an angle from climate finance, an angle from fossil fuels, but an angle also from citizenry as well as the community-led approach. And it reminds me of a wedding, a Christian wedding that happens in a lot of African communities where the guests come along and then you're followed by the grooms. But then the main story of that day is always the bride. And I think in this case, the bride is definitely the fact sheet in itself. And I'd like to invite my brother Dean, who's been part of the Africa Finance Watch Coalition, to basically give us a rundown on this fact sheet and for the attendees that we have today to think about some of these points that Dean will be putting across, but also reminding yourself of what was mentioned by Raj, Sada, as well as Samuel. So Dean, please take the floor.
Thanks, Kuda, for that. Please let me know if you can hear me clearly. Thank you.
We can hear you, my brother.
All right, great. I'm going to share my screen so we can do a slide version and make it a bit more visual and interactive for everyone. I hope that's okay. Hopefully that would be a thing. Yeah. What can you guys see right now? Can you see
we can see your Zoom link, my brother. I think that's not what you want to show us.
Are you okay now? Do you see that?
No, we still can't see it. I'd assume you'd have to unshare and then, yeah.
Let me try again. How's that?
Yes, fantastic.
All right, thanks. All right, I'm just gonna remove my video so that you guys can see me clearly. If that doesn't work out, that's perfectly fine. All right, thanks everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you again for joining. It's been months doing this fact sheet, and obviously it's great to see the impact that it's had. I've been seeing some of the comments, but also reflections from the panelists that obviously this was something that was needed and a big gap. So today I'll be sharing an overview of why the African Export-Import Bank, or AFREXIM, has become such a crucial player in Africa's energy future, and why it's important for think tanks, for campaigners, policymakers alike, why we should be paying close attention to them. So this presentation essentially draws on the latest data that has been compiled by PowerShift Africa to really support advocacy for a fair and just energy transition across the African continent, essentially. So looking at it, I mean, AFREXIM is not just another financial institution. It's majority owned essentially by African government, which means it's using public capital to actually shape the continent's economic and energy future, and that's very important. And it has a shareholder governance structure where countries like Egypt, Nigeria hold significant voting power. And the bank is deeply integrated in what we like to call global markets, issuing bonds and working with multilateral development banks. So any shifts in AFREXIM policy can have ripple effects across both Africa and the global financial system. And most importantly, it acts as a gatekeeper of investment, co-financing major regional projects and influencing national energy trajectories. So what kind of financial firepower are we essentially talking about? AFREXIM's total assets have surged from about close to 30 billion, right, in 2022 to close to 35 billion in 2023. Its loan portfolio is looking, if we're looking at 2023 as a date, we're looking at 5.2 billion, which went to oil and gas, compared to 1.3 billion to the power sector. And then we're looking at $699 million, close to $1 billion again going to health, and just 100 million going to agriculture. So a big question mark on them prioritizing a lot on mitigation in comparison to adaptation. So this clearly shows the scale of influence that the bank essentially has and the direction much of that financing is flowing to. And the vast majority of its facilities are traditional loans and credit lines, meaning that its decisions directly shape investments landscapes. But I guess the good question to ask based on that is, what does that mean for Africa's energy transition? So AFREXIM's approach to energy transition is inconsistent, right? On one hand, it acknowledges the climate collapse, the climate goals. They speak of green industrialization, but on the other, it's still heavily influencing and financing fossil fuels, especially oil and gas on the African continent. So there's no fossil fuel investment ban, or rather a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy, as we would like to call it within this space. Instead, gas is framed as a transition fuel, which looks at gas providing this energy loop while we think around what it means to transition or leapfrog towards renewable energy, which essentially, again, as you may all know, locks us in as a continent in fossil fuel infrastructure that would then be stranded assets within 20 years if we are to actually take this trajectory forward. The bank has financed LNG imports, refinery upgrades, and major pipelines, including ECOP, and also the West African gas pipeline. So it has also set up, or is thinking, and trying to offer technical assistance to setting up what we call the Africa Energy Bank, which is going to have over 5 billion capital infused into it to fund both fossil fuels and renewable energy projects. And these actions essentially can again lock us into fossil fuel dependency for decades, even as global capitals shift away from carbon. So to understand its impact, we need to now take a closer look at some of the bank's notable projects and activities, essentially. AFREXIM has been involved in a number of key projects across Africa. In 2020, they financed LNG equipment imports in Tanzania and Mozambique. In 2023, it was supporting cross-border gas infrastructure studies in Southern Africa. And in 2025, it committed to over 1 billion to support offshore fossil gas developments in Guyana, and this shows a pattern. AFREXIM is a major enabler of fossil fuel infrastructure at a time, obviously, when the world is calling for rapid decarbonization. And I will try my best to not, step over my words when I said, the world is calling for rapid decarbonization. I think the world deserves renewable energy and a decarbonization pathway. But unfortunately, we do not have enough political ambition from governments and from financial institutions such as AFREXIM to actually then operationalize that. So where does this leave campaigners like ourselves, policymakers? How do we shift AFREXIM's direction? And, we really try to provide this resource pack for everyone to really think around this, because it is important, given, where Africa currently stands, given our renewable energy potential. And just to remind everyone, we've got over 8,625 gigawatts of potential. But out of that, only under 70 gigawatts has been installed, right? Which is under 2% or maybe 1%. Fortunately, maths is not my strong suit, but it's essentially a very small number. And essentially, we have to think about the different advocacy strategies, and that's what we're trying to do with this resource for everyone. How do we think around AFREXIM being publicly owned? So it's meaning that because it's publicly owned, it's publicly accountable. So there are several strategic entry points of advocacy, and I'm just going to really bulldoze through them. We can think around research and transparency. How do we push for independent audits, FOI requests, and even data on their energy portfolio? How do we lobby member states as well? Could be another aspect. How do we target the large shareholders like Egypt and Nigeria to push for policy change? How do we engage with the actual, AFREXIM Secretariat at their annual general meetings, much like the movement has been doing historically with the AFDB and the World Bank, including ADB, including EBRD as well. So these are moments when governance decisions are essentially made or happen. So this becomes a platform during the AGMs that are ideal for raising issues and organizing actions, if that's something that we want to do. How do we target global investors? So many of the bondholders have what we call ESG requirements that AFREXIM might essentially meet. So how do we see that as an intervention point for our advocacy efforts? And I guess finally, how do we build coalitions, which we've done rightfully, right, through the Africa Finance Watch across civil society. But remember, we want a just transition that leaves no one behind. So think around trade unions, think about research institutes, and even international allies to essentially increase the pressure. Ultimately, this is about shifting one of Africa's most powerful institutions, and AFREXIM's influence is essentially enormous. And I'm sure this fact sheet is going to demonstrate that, essentially, to say the very least. And if we can shift its financing priorities away from fossil fuels and towards a just, inclusive energy transition, the ripple effects will be felt across the entire continent, because this is not just a financial issue. It's about who shapes Africa's future and whether that future locks us into old, outdated, dangerous, short-sighted systems, or builds towards the green industries and infrastructures that the continent needs. So PowerShift Africa and its allies, together with the Africa Finance Watch and many, many other coalitions that are on this call, we're trying our best, and these are our first steps to trying to make this happen. And I do encourage everyone to engage with the fact sheet, whether through research, whether through policy, whether through advocacy. Whatever key you may use, it will unlock a certain door that will lead us to the outcome we rightfully deserve as African people. Thank you so much, and back to you, good as the moderator.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dean. And I think you providing us a landing zone to understand how we as civil society can link the work with AFREXIM Bank, I think is important, especially in this new and not new, but growing dominance of the idea of public finance. And for a long time, we're focused on global north financing and how that affects us in the global south. But this really comes back home to say we do have our own assets, and it's also important to understand how we're using those assets. In this moment, I would like to invite anyone who's willing to turn on their camera, turn on the audio to ask a question. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I have 3 questions now that have come to my private inbox here, which is okay, but it would be great if 1 or 2 of you are willing to ask the questions. I can give you 30 seconds. You can raise your hand so that the admin can be able to pick you out. I think I saw a hand go up and down, and then I lost it. Let me double check again. Yes, Imam, um, you've been given the platform. Imam, I think you can turn on, you can speak now.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my camera, but I can't see it.
It's okay. We can hear your voice
Okay,
beautifully and perfectly.
thank you, Dean. Thank you, Sam, and team at PowerShift Africa for that, well-detailed fact sheet about, the work AFREXIM is doing injustices, land rights violation, but also to all participants. You have done justice to this conversation. And adding on what my colleague Sam from Uganda has just said, you find, for example, we have Uganda's Bankers Association. Now, that association has integrated what we call the ESG framework, where all banks, including the international banks, are supposed, for example, to show what are they going to invest and their finance, like their money not going to impact communities, displacing communities, what Sam has been saying. But you find now on what's on ground, AFREXIM Bank is still funding ECOP. This is what is, displacing people from their land. But also, if it comes to compensation, it has been unfair, untimely. When they talk about the 15% uplift for the delayed compensation, it hasn't been fulfilled. So what, like the last presenter said, what other advocacy strategies can we deploy? Because you find these frameworks, they have been commanded or recommended to, embed framework within the, their financial system, but it's not working. What other mechanisms can we deploy? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Imam. I think that's a great question. And I think that's directed to your brother there, Samuel. And what I'll also do, let me just also take the opportunity to ask the other three questions I got, but I think the other one I can combine it essentially. This one I think is for Raj and Dean. And this colleague of ours says, our fossil fuel is not the best investment option for Africa to attract investment. Dangote has set up a huge oil plant to push Nigeria and Africa's growth. AFREXIM Bank should fund such projects, no? With a question mark at the end. And then I think this one for you, Sada. What is the difference between ESG and climate finance? I think you can take those questions on board in any order you prefer, dear colleagues.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks you, Imam, for that question and elaborately discussing in terms of the impacts that we have faced and seen with the African Bank and how they are actually investing. Specifically looking into the bank that is coming in, I think we have, beyond what Dean has basically said, there are different advocacy spaces that we need to undertake. One is on the legal strategy that we can be able to do, looking into our own laws. We know that there is a public interest litigation provisions within our laws that we can be able to deploy, especially if a bank has violated the rights of the local communities and how it is, and the case can be brought by anybody that feels like this has been violated. And the precedent as well, one with the ICG ruling, so should be able to explore different options that can be able to undertake. And there is more in terms of getting this into the public domain. Like I said in the beginning, not much of the information about African Bank had been put into public domain. And thanks a lot to PowerShip that has been put this in one package. It is need to get more people to understand where is the money. Let's follow the money. Where is the money coming in from? What is it doing? And can we be able to hold the financials accountable? Because if you finance our destruction, that means you're responsible for our destruction, leave alone just the company that is doing the actual work on ground. So we need to explore all those avenues and ensure that we're able to follow the money, explore different legal strategies that we can be able to deploy, and ensure that we're able to involve the fourth estate, the media, ensure that we're able to popularize this more. Now with the fact sheet read out, let's try to break it down, share it, let everybody be able to really articulate and understand what it is and deploy different tactics. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Yusuf, I see your hand. If we can just allow this first round of questions to be answered, and then we'll come to you. Raj, Dean, or Sada?
Kuda, do you mind repeating the question again? Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that the light bulb moment I had was correct.
Okay, let me do that. Just give me a second to open. Yes. Are fossil fuels not the best investment option for Africa to attract investment? Dangote has set up a huge oil plant to push Nigeria and Africa's growth. AFREXIM Bank should fund such projects, no? That was the question.
Okay. Well, thanks. The answer is no. Essentially, if you look at Senegal, for example, I'm going to use 3 countries or 4 or 5. Let's see where we land. if you look at Senegal, first of all, they've got oil and they've got gas essentially, but the country is currently servicing 67% against its GDP to service debt. The Sangoma oil phase mine plant is owned by Woodside, which is 78%, leaving only under 20% of revenue to the Senegalese government. Now imagine with that, and also coupled up with the fact that they've got that debt that they have to service as a country. They're not making enough money out of it, not to take into account the environmental considerations, essentially, right? The fishing sector has been heavily affected in Senegal, for example. There's just not enough income coming in because of the deteriorating marine ecosystem as a result of fossil fuels. Same goes to Nigeria. Health-wise, look, the expectancy rate in terms of life expectancy in the Niger Delta is 42 years old. I don't think that is actually then grounding this economic model on development, essentially. Even if we were to say today, I'm going to play the devil's advocate and I'm going to extract oil and I'm going to extract gas, right? Let's say we want to do that 100%. Let's do that. Africa does not have refining capabilities, essentially. Yes, we can argue about what Dangote has done, but still, Nigeria is still exporting all of its crude oil. When you sell out that oil into a foreign country or into a foreign entity, right, you are buying it as Nigeria. That means I'm going to get my money in Naira. And my crude oil is going to get refined, it's going to get processed. Now I need to buy it back. Now, because of the volatility of the foreign exchange market and the foreign currency market, I have to buy it in pounds, euros, or US dollars, which leaves me as the Nigerian government at a risk because I do not take into account that I have to change my nairas. And what I sold my raw material at that point in time, and maybe 2 months later, to which I now need a finished product, is essentially different. I'm not breaking even. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the World Bank and borrow money so I can continue extracting, so I can continue producing crude oil. So that economic model essentially is not working. That is why we are trapped in this dependency. Even if you look at the inputs, the energy value chain inputs, it's essentially just expensive to build out a gas infrastructure. It's essentially expensive in the long run to build out an oil infrastructure. Renewable energy has proven to be quite affordable in terms of if we're looking at it from the inputs required to actually produce energy, from planning, from coordination, planning to execution to transmission, essentially, right? And largely that's because you don't have to build out a gas infrastructure plant to actually absorb the sun, for example. I don't need to generate wind. We already have that for free. So we actually own much of the bigger chunk in terms of the inputs needed, and to even add on to that, the idea around the critical minerals or the green minerals or the transition minerals necessary. Right now, part of the problem is that it's more expensive to buy a solar panel in Africa than it is in India. So the whole point is, how do we then create a developmental pathway that acknowledges all these efforts into something that is holistic and worthwhile for the African continent? Currently, fossil fuels do not encourage job opportunities. There are health risks. There are water risks as well. If we give you the figures, that's what it takes to just produce 10 megawatts of electricity using water in comparison to renewable energy. It is extremely different, and the gap is wide. And already the continent is actually then water stressed. So there are water considerations, health considerations. Now, again, the last point is, because you want to use fossil fuels, meaning that if I was to give you electricity, it's going to be far more expensive because of the energy inputs, given the economic model that I've described. Renewable energy does make it cheaper. And I'm mentioning this because we live in Africa. There's an unemployment rate. There's an inequality gap that has been historically been perpetuated by financial institutions as well. So we need to look at this from a holistic perspective, because the whole point is, how do we make electricity affordable, but beyond affordability, accessibility, and beyond it being accessible, how is it a reliable energy source as well, in order for us to actually unlock the necessary developmental pathways. Africa can leverage its inputs right now. We just need the right ecosystem. But I think Raj will also step in and add on to what I've said. Thanks.
No, thanks a lot, Dean. I think you've covered it comprehensively. For me, I think the one thing I would definitely add there is always the issue of women and youth, frontline communities. Right now, does Dangote's refinery actually get oil back to the communities in Nigeria? Are they actually able to use it? think of the same thing around a gas pipeline. Are any of the, are any actual communities being able to access basic energy through, liquefied natural gas or through LPG? Are any of these sources actually working for us? Then why are we continuously, putting our monies into it? And I think one thing Dean has already talked about is the system that we are in. This is a systemic issue. It's not just one thing. You can't just think about the fact that 600 million people don't have access to energy. They also don't have access to water. Their basic rights to, health, education, and perhaps their future is defined by any sort of, financing that banks like AFREXIM puts in. I think Dean started with that on, his fact sheet, that if we allow this bank to decide our pathway and our developmental pathway, it means that's what we are going to, probably the next generation, 2-3 generations, that's what they're going to see themselves into. We have the highest youth bulge. Are they ready for, while globally people are moving to decarbonization pathway, Europe and most of the global north is moving away from fossils. We know, yes, with the turn of the US, the whole thing around building more gas pipelines or oil extraction is back on the agenda. But look at, a lot of other global north countries. Many of them are thinking about net zero. Many of them are thinking about, how they can shut down their fossil industries into renewables. Where are they coming for, looking for these sources back to the continent? And we don't want to be back in that cycle. The point here is, if you have the opportunity to define, a new pathway for yourself, then use it and actually allow the people that are, are suffering on the front line to actually be the ones to make that decision. So it's not about, can we allow fossil fuels, to carry on? Is it, why are we allowing it to carry on when we have all these other resources that are cheap, that are affordable?
Thanks for that, Raj. I don't know if it's my Wi-Fi or yours, but I think I'm losing connectivity a bit there. But I hope you can still hear me. Just a raise of hand if you can still hear me, guys. Okay, fantastic. I think, Sada, this was the opportunity to provide what's the difference between ESG and climate finance. And I think this is extremely important in the AFREXIM conversation.
Thank you, Kuda, and thank you for that question. I think I'll attempt to answer it, but anyone else can contribute from the panel. So I think ESG is basically aligning finances towards sustainability with regards to ensuring that the financial investments are not contributing to environmental degradation or pollution and such stuff. It's very, very much limited to environmental concerns. And like climate finance is broader and covers, including climate finance and, including environmental concerns, but broader than that, to include activities related to reducing greenhouse gas emission and also strengthening adaptation and resilience capacities of systems and livelihoods. And if you look at the governance issue between the two, they're also distinct because climate finance governance is under the UNFCCC process, while ESG is very much related to business and even for private sector. And that's why there's a lot of focus and alignment of private sector to ESG because they can see it directly affects their businesses because it also affects how their crediting rating standing is and also in terms of how they can access money from the international markets. And like climate, the alignment with Paris Agreement and climate actions is more considered voluntary, like a public good or something that is not really strict. So the enforcement and mechanisms are also a bit loose on the climate finance governance side than ESG. But even with that strict enforcement in the ESG, you see a lot of greenwashing as well from private sector investors and also financial institutions to sort of not really addressing the climate environmental concerns, but also contributing to its degradation and also and other pollution issues. So that's just broadly how we can differentiate the two. Thanks.
So that's Sada. Yusuf, if you're still there, we'll give you the tremendous honor of asking the last question, and then we can get a response from the panel, and then we can conclude. Yusuf? Have I lost Yusuf? Yusuf? Adil? I seem to have lost my colleague, which is tremendously unfortunate. Okay, so we have about 3 minutes. So what I'll do, in case does anyone else have a question before I just conclude? Okay. As they would say at an auction site, going once, going twice, going thrice, and it is definitely gone. No, that is fine and no problem at all. But first of all, I'd like to thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this fact sheet launch. I think the Africa Import Export Bank is really a pivotal bank in terms of our own growth and development as a continent. And if you look at what China was able to do in terms of their own renewable energy explosion, what Europe has done in terms of their own industrialization post World War II, the import export banks of those regions was extremely important. And the question for us, and if not more, the call for us is to try ensure that African Bank plays such a pivotal role as we see the changing dynamics and environment in terms of the global economy, not only for the sake of Africa's development, but also and more importantly, for the sake of us realizing that it is possible to industrialize and decarbonize at the same time as providing development. What that then requires is quality public financing that we can get from African Bank, directing it into the much needed areas of development that focus on the energy needs of the continent, but also the infrastructural and developmental needs. It is, I think, a great thing that we got from this fact sheet that there is some capacity, there is some public financing available on this continent. And the thing we need to do now is that divest from the fossil fuel industry into that renewable energy industry that speak to the needs of community, that speak to the needs of citizens, but at the same time speak to that call that we've been calling for a long time as the Global South, a just transition that is mandated and based on climate financing, targeting, and being pushed in the right area. Thank you so much to Sada, Rajneesh, Dean, as well as Samuel for being the great panelists here. Again, my dear colleagues and attendees, please note that the fact sheet will be available on the PowerShift Africa website as well as the other social media platforms. But we hope that you download it and put it into your phones, into your memories, and into your hearts. And also, please do feel free to share it around as much as possible. It'll be great for us to get comments on it to understand where we can improve, what we can do next, so that we advance this conversation. Once again, thank you so much. And as I give you 1 minute back of your time, always stay safe, always stay free. And remember, the sun and wind is always free for Africa. We just have to improve on it and invest in it. Thank you so much, everyone.